Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Licensing Committee. My name is Councillor Paul Ray, and I will be chairing today's meeting. Could I remind everyone that the meeting today is being live streamed onto the City Council website, so the public can observe the meeting without the need to be present. Just for those members of the public watching on the live cast, we do have some camera issues in here, so we won't actually focus on anyone's faces. I'll let you judge in the public whether that's a good or a bad thing. And just to the people in the room today who are here, who are not councillors or officers, this is a council meeting in public. It isn't a public meeting, so please just be aware that this is a meeting for councillors and officers only. Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves and mute themselves once they have. So I'll start from this side. Rob.
Good morning. My name is Robert Brown. I'm a solicitor in Leeds City Council's Legal Services, and I'm the legal advisor to the committee today.
Hi, Councillor Jess Lennox from Crossgates and Winmore.
Hello, Councillor Lisa Martin from Roundhay.
Good morning, Councillor James Gibson, Crossgates and Winmore Ward.
Councillor John Illingworth from Kirkstall Ward.
Susan Duckworth from Entertainment Licensing, and to my right is Lucy Fidders, who is also from Entertainment Licensing.
Good morning, everyone. John Mulcahy, Chief Officer, Elections and Regulatory.
Morning, everybody. Andrew White, Taxi and Private Hire Licensing Manager.
Good morning. I'm Graham Berwick. I'm from Taxi Private Hire Licensing.
Morning, Councillor Rick Downs, Otley and Eden Ward.
Councillor Hutchison, Morley North Ward.
Councillor Neil Buckley, or Woodley Ward.
Councillor Linda Richards, Wetherby Ward.
Good morning, Billy Flynn, Councillor for Adlam Wharfdale Ward.
Good morning, Councillor Paul Alderson, Guiseley and Rodham Ward.
Good morning, John Grieve, Governance Services, Norway Clark in today's meeting.
Thank you, everyone, for your attendance. Moving to item agenda number 1.
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there were no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item 2, there were no items which require the exclusion of the press or public. Under item 3, late items. Although we've got no late items as such, I understand members have received information from the Hackney Carriage Association and Joint Trades Council, who have offered comment on the taxi and private hire harmonisation proposals, and that's agenda item number 9 of your pack. Agenda item number 4, could I ask members to declare any interests? I see none, so I'll assume that's none. Apologies for absence. We've got a couple, Chair. Councillor Garthwaite, Councillor Biffle and Councillor Smart. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Item agenda number 6, minutes of the previous meeting. Do members accept these minutes as a true and correct record? I'll assume correct unless indicated otherwise. Yep, okay, we'll assume those are correct, thank you. Item number 6, matters arising from the minutes. Are there any matters arising from the minutes? Again, please indicate. No, nice and quick, we like that, great. Item agenda number 8, cumulative impact assessment. Could I ask Sue Duckworth from Entertainment Licence to present this report, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, members. This is a report regarding the cumulative impact assessment that was due to be undertaken this year. As you will be aware, we have had a rather extraordinary 18 months, and with the nighttime economy being effectively shut down for a good part of the last 18 months. When we do a cumulative impact assessment, we look at all the crime statistics and other data which relate to the areas that are specially designated in the cumulative impact assessment. If we had undertaken this review when we should have done, which was earlier in the year, our data would have been deficient because the nighttime economy was shut for a good part of the reporting period. What we did do is we delayed calling for those statistics for as long as we possibly could. And when we have approached the police from July onwards, they unfortunately have to report to us that crime is on the increase again. As such, what we would like to propose to Licensing Committee today is to do a brief interim review this year based on the statistics over the last 18 months, but bearing in mind what has gone on. And then do a much fuller, more detailed review this time next year when we have got a good 12 months worth of data after the nighttime economy is reopened. I'm happy to take questions or to go into specific details, especially if you wanted to go into details of each of the areas and what's been happening over the last 18 months. But I'll do that under questions if that's okay, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Just to put my piece in, I think it's a very sensible recommendation, but I'll now open up to questions or comments from members of the panel. Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. I think it's a very sensible proposal, and I propose that we accept the recommendation. Obviously, if members want to ask questions about the current policy, fine, but it seems a very sensible one to me.
Councillor Buckley.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I agree with Councillor Flynn. The question I wanted to ask was just looking at the various tables of crime and incidents and so on. It seems to refer to 2017. And I just wondered why the figures were so far back, because obviously we didn't have a problem until 2020.
The document you've got there is the current 2018 community impact assessment that we did using 3 years ago. We haven't undertaken the interim review yet. So it was there really just for information, so that to remind members, especially members that might be new onto committee, what our community impact assessment looks like. Okay.
Any other questions or comments? Yep.
Thanks, Chair. Just one, Sue. That you say that obviously we don't have a current report. There hasn't been much nighttime economy to report on, but the police have then said coming back, it's looking bad. There's an increase. Have we any indication at this stage just how bad that is? Is it a minor increase, or is it something that we need to be really worried about?
So during the lockdowns, obviously everything went very quiet. And with the nighttime economy closed entirely for a good proportion of 2020, and then with interim closures this year, the crime rates remained very low right the way up until July, when the nighttime economy opened. And then I'm advised that in the city centre specifically, the crime rates have risen back to their previous levels. Now, we don't know if that was an impact of having the premises shut for so long and then suddenly reopening and people getting super excited and that kind of impact. We just are not sure what the long-term impact is, which is why we're saying we need to be looking at this in 12 months. What we've asked for when we've called for the stats this time is a month-by-month breakdown so that we can see the curve. And what we're hoping is that what we'll see is we'll see a blip and then we'll see it go settle back to its more usual levels. We were really hoping that this would work as a fire break and that we would see an overall reduction in crime and disorder in the city centre, and that hasn't happened.
Yeah, thanks for that. So yeah, it's important, I think, to understand where they are in relation to what they were pre-COVID, because obviously year on year they're going to be up because there weren't any for the previous year. All I would ask for is within that review, and I totally support this proposal, and we need to know where we're going, but within that review, a bit of sort of, like you were saying, has it increased due to sort of the excitement of going back and then plateaued? And to do it monthly is great. And I just think if we can perhaps get a little bit of intelligence behind that, some commentary behind the figures, when we come to analyse them, you know, what is the reason? Can we sort of say it is because of that, or is it just that everything's out of control? Is it down to police numbers? Is it, you know, what's driving the increase, and is it something that can naturally turn around, or is it something that interventions are required? Thank
you for that. Any other comments or questions? No, thank you for that. So we asked to approve an interim review and consultation to ensure that cumulative impact remains appropriate until a detailed and thorough review of the assessment can take place in 2022. Members happy to accept the recommendation as set out on page 9 of the agenda pack. If I can have a show of hands, please. There we go. Nice and unanimous. Thank you very much for that, Sue. Cheers. Item agenda number 9, taxi and private hire licensing, West Yorkshire and York Harmonization. Could I invite Andrew from taxi and private hire licensing to present the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just aware that members of the committee for this year, this is possibly the first time you've seen a report on the West Yorkshire and York work, or even though we've mentioned it in, or we've touched on it in discussions elsewhere. So I think it was something that the Chair asked me to provide a report on update, and particularly the review we want to have with the other 5 authorities in the West Yorkshire and York group to review our progress, see if one more push would get us there on in terms of some of the areas, or to see if there's areas that we need to undertake differently. It's quite a long report. I go into quite some detail. I'm not going to walk everybody through every single point. What I'll do is I'll stop at the end of the introduction and section 2, and then we'll go into the specific points around the 6 areas that we focused on, and then we'll have, I think probably the aim, Chair, is to have a broader discussion about other areas of risk or areas that we might regard as being new pressures, new concerns, and we would have that discussion then. So just a summary, really, just to introduce you. We've had a project in place since about 2016, and I think early in 2016, the 6 authorities all changed their constitutions so that, importantly, their enforcement officers could actually undertake some of the enforcement work mainly on the vehicles of neighbouring authorities when they're, if you like, a Kirk Leeds vehicle in Leeds. So that's been in place for several years. There's 5 other areas of progress as well that I'll talk you through, but I think it's important to understand that this is a focus specifically on passenger safety. This came in the wake of the concerns about Rotherham. I think the concerns in 2015 and 16 were around Rossendale vehicles that were driving in some parts of West Yorkshire, primarily probably Calderdale and Bradford, not so much in Leeds, but we were seeing them. We were seeing Transport for London vehicles in Leeds in 2016. We don't see that anymore. One of the major areas of cross-border concern now is vehicles actually coming from outside of West Yorkshire. So we know that Wolverhampton, I think I touched on the previous report, has issued something like 25,000 private hire driver licenses in the last 4 years. Wolverhampton's not that big. Those drivers and vehicles are all over the country. So I think so. This is a taster on that. The risk issues surrounded with cross-border working and the awareness that authorities can no longer really regard themselves as having these sort of borders. We talk about borders or boundaries between authorities. Actually, those vehicles move and the drivers move. So the focus today is really is to review, evaluate the 6 previously identified areas, and just to go through why we focused on those 6, and to determine then whether they remain the right areas or whether we should actually have a broader regional review. And it's something that's going on across the UK. I think you've just heard from Sue. COVID has affected all sorts of aspects of the nighttime economy, and as well for us, we're concerned as well around transport to and from schools, care, hospitals, and so on. So we've got all sorts of issues that anything that affects the structure and makeup of the trading leads is worth us looking at to see if it has an effect on passenger safety. So just turning to page 80 and the background information. Just to reiterate, the purpose of taxi and private hire licensing is to keep the travelling public safe. That is the rationale for it, and that's always the first thing that we would look to do. The increase, and there's been an increase since 2013 really in drivers and vehicles making journeys across borders, and the rise in cross-border working, and in some cases it's absolutely prevalent, has revealed inconsistencies in standards, and in turn that creates a weak link. If people can be licensed in one authority and work predominantly in another authority and take advantage of weaknesses in licensing systems or weaknesses in enforcement, that then could pose a risk. And the example that we could draw on there could be a driver who is suspended in one authority because he's failed his medical, his eye test, is not fit to drive. But if he thinks he can work somewhere else and is in an authority that doesn't know he's suspended, he could carry on driving. So there's concerns just on that level around the motivations for people to be licensed in one area and work in another. It always remains the council's responsibility to develop, review and update taxi and private hire licensing policies and practice to this end. So although we would collaborate with neighbouring authorities, we would consult and engage with the trade. It's the council's responsibility to do that. Unlike hackney carriage, licensing authorities just do not have the power to restrict the number of licenses for private hire drivers or vehicles. It's in that respect, it's an unregulated industry. We can have as many or as few as the market supports. So particularly where we have concerns around a shock to the system affecting earnings, again, our focus primarily from a licensing point of view would be on the public safety side of that. And we've definitely had a shock to the system that's affected the earnings in Leeds. Some authorities have seen an increase in the number of drivers and vehicles they license. So I've mentioned Wolverhampton. In Leeds, the numbers have stayed about the same. They've actually dropped since COVID, unsurprisingly. We've got about 700 fewer vehicles and about 300 fewer drivers. And that's causing a problem for some private hire operators, for some hackney carriage associations. And particularly, we're getting more complaints around people, particularly people using wheelchairs, saying that they're not able to fulfill their journey. There's little provision in our current regional work on some of those aspects around honouring journeys and dealing with those complaints. I think the wider context there is just the rise in the number and scale and scope of operators who work deliberately across local authority boundaries as well. So there's a whole list of operators that primarily see themselves as tech companies and only recently have regarded themselves as having workers. They may not yet be employees, but smartphone technology has enabled people now to push a button on their phone and to hail a vehicle that comes within 2 to 4 minutes in some cases. So it's not immediate, but it's within very short notice. So licensing authorities can license operators, drivers and vehicles who intend to work regularly or predominantly outside of their licensing district. There was a test case probably about 3 years ago of an authority in the Northwest that sought to try and reduce that. So that would be equivalent of Leeds asking or requiring that its drivers in its authority would work for, say, 75% of their time in Leeds. That was thrown out. That was appealed and then thrown out by the High Court. So we know that although we can't limit the numbers, we also have got limited levers to affect cross-border working. At some point in the work programme, we will have a review of operator conditions to say, well, short of the law changing, what else can we do? And that will, a lot of that, I think, will focus on the booking, will focus on the use of smartphone apps, and particularly, I would have thought, the passenger preference. Do you want a local driver? And if you want a local driver, we would want operators to be able to offer a local driver who's been trained and passed training in the geography of the area where they're working. So just finally, on the first part, that the councils work with the neighbouring authorities. I think it marked a significant change from what we would do differently. Probably previously we would have had all 6 authorities working very, very differently. There's probably an awful lot that the 5 authorities in West Yorkshire have got in common in terms of that. And I think particularly it's a positive way of looking at developments if you can get that agreement across the authority. The Department for Transport has issued a set of statutory guidance that actually strongly recommends in 3 or 4 areas, including consultation, including when you review or change policies, including sort of communication, including intelligence, where actually there should be a requirement for those authorities to work closely together. As I said, since 2016, we've actually changed some of the job descriptions and some of the legal powers. But it may well be that we need to go further. We haven't done reciprocal arrangements with Selby or with Harrogate or with other neighbouring authorities, and yet once in a while we see their vehicles in Leeds. Primarily for Leeds, this would be vehicles we see from other authorities in Leeds. But York would also see Leeds vehicles in York, particularly, maybe not so much in the other authorities. Okay. I'm just going to turn to the impact of COVID, and then I'll pause there and just see if there's any questions. So I think I've summarised a lot of the impact of COVID. We know that taxi and private hire fulfills a really important transport function in Leeds. Although maybe potentially a small percentage number of all the total journeys in Leeds, it's a much higher percentage of journeys that people who have a mobility need or a disability. It's a much larger proportion of those journeys. So the most recent Department for Transport report that went to the House of Commons said that people with a disability or mobility probably take between 20 or 30 taxi or private hire journeys a year, and the average is probably fewer than 10. So it's a significant increase there. We also know, I think, that those people who are disabled, have a mobility need, also at risk of harm, particularly children and so on, older people, they're also more likely to need to travel to and from school or health appointments. For some people, their number of journeys by taxi and private hire will actually have gone up in the last 18 months, at the same time as there's been a fall off in terms of the availability of vehicles or the number of drivers. In a pre-pandemic year, and this is taken from something called the unmet demand survey that we would want to revisit when we finish the roadworks in the city centre. We estimate there's more than 30 million journeys either starting or finishing in Leeds. So it's an enormous number. Taxi and private hire trade is a significant trade. They're dealing with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of journeys every day. We want all those services to continue safely during the COVID pandemic, during now where we've still got extra measures, and we want those vehicles and those drivers to be available to us when the restrictions and social distancing end completely. I think lockdown has significantly reduced demand for taxis and private hire, and I think in some cases we've heard that some drivers have moved into delivery, have moved into food, and I think particularly in terms of the trade, they're saying we're not sure if those drivers are coming back. They haven't yet not renewed their licenses, but that will be the test over the next 6 months as to whether those people are going to return or not. We may well have a much lower level of drivers or vehicles going forward. So particularly, we think that it is relevant that we're aware of the impact of COVID, particularly on the availability of vehicles. I think we're much more interested in where the earnings of taxi and private hire drivers and operators impact on their passengers' safety than just the earnings per se. This is a trade where people do drop in and drop out of the trade, and therefore it's seen to regulate itself. So that's the background. First part, focus on public safety, the logic for regional or sub-regional coordination, and then secondly, I think the context of we've had a really difficult 18 months. And as we resume services now, we're reviewing what the impact is. We're going to have meetings with the other West Yorkshire and York authorities. Very interested to see if the fall in Leeds is met with an increase in other authorities. That might tell us something different, or if there's been a pattern around sort of mergers and takeovers from operators, and we might find there's fewer operators working in the suburbs or the outlying towns, which is a real concern, I think, in terms of availability of drivers and vehicles. I'll just stop there in terms of that sort of position, background information.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Bear in mind that was kind of the summary of where we are and what taxi and private hire licenses is for. I'm just mindful that colleagues may want to get into the more meaty aspects of this report. So is there any pressing questions now around the generalities of taxi and private hire licensing, or can we let Andrew get into the meaty part of it? Over to you again, Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. So the main issues, so the 6 authorities have agreed to work together, in part because we identify there are some cross-council interest there. So each of the authorities has recognised that either their vehicles, their drivers are working regularly in another authority, or that there is a risk of that, or in some cases the boundaries are so overlapping that therefore people making normal journeys would be regularly driving across different local authority areas. The main focus was around strengthening cross-council procedures, strengthening cross-council policies, so that there was an evening up to prevent the risk of a weak link somewhere in the region, allowing then people who broadly would say would not be appropriate to work, or reducing the number of checks, or reducing the background checks, or reducing the efficacy of those checks, and particularly to overcome the risk impact of licence shopping. So that is predominantly to be licensed in one authority, but work all your time in another authority. And think particularly it's really unpopular with large parts of the trade. It is not illegal. It absolutely is permitted. In terms that it causes all sorts of problems, just in terms of we would say just in terms of people who see a vehicle that's not usual, looks like it's out of town. They might not know which authority it's licensed in. It might not have stickers, the same as in the authority that they see, if they're not sure about something. And I think anything that acts as a discouragement for someone to say, I've seen something that's not right, but I don't know who to get in touch with. So if someone sees a Kirklees vehicle in Leeds, do I ring Leeds? Do I ring Kirklees? The answer is you can ring either of us. There's no wrong door on that, and we'll work very closely together to deal with that. So those sorts of things around those risks and those concerns. One of the aspects of the policy development is this response to pressures against local licensing. And there's no doubt, for example, the largest private hire operator in Leeds, Uber, is only licensed in 7 authorities in South and West Yorkshire. So they're licensed in the 5 authorities in West Yorkshire, and they're licensed in Sheffield and Rotherham. I'm not aware that they're licensed anywhere else, and they've lost their license in York, and yet they will work all over West Yorkshire. So there's the rationale there is that they don't seek a license in every authority where their drivers and vehicles plan to work. So because drivers and vehicles can work regularly across council borders, there's a range of factors then in neighbouring authorities working together, understanding and addressing the risks, and particularly those risks that might be daytime, that might be to do with general information in terms of the standard of vehicles, but it might be something very specific about nighttime enforcement. We know Leeds has got the largest nighttime economy in the region. We're hoping that on a busy night between now and Christmas, we'll have 100,000 people in Leeds city centre. That's far more than you would get in the town centres and city centres of the neighbouring authorities. So we know Leeds to some degree is the honeypot. There we've got more students. We've got other destinations in Leeds that mean that there's more people coming into Leeds. So the primary aim was to review the existing arrangements and just turning the page to section 3.5, particularly just to focus on the 6 areas where the authorities had a sort of brainstorm. We had a much longer list and focused on these 6. And the aim was to have common minimum standards, to not have everything aimed at being identical. I think we've looked at a review of our supporting policies, and we've got 24 supporting policies, so several policies for each of driver, vehicle, operator. The aim was to develop common minimum standards, and even in those cases it would still be possible for an authority to have standards above the minimum, but all authorities would adopt standards at, around or above the standard agreed. And I'll just go through the 6 in summary, and then the rest of the section on the main issues is then going in more detail. I don't propose to go into great detail, but to open up the discussion then around those specific areas. So here are the 6. So one was CCTV in vehicles, particularly that was about developing a common policy, common standard. Actually, we've had a working group in Leeds, and we've worked through the advice from the Information Commissioner. The advice from the Information Commissioner is very clear on the standards that you need for CCTV. So I'm not sure quite what would be gained by other authorities doing their own research. If they took the Information Commissioner, they'd get very clear advice. But a standardized specification, if you have CCTV in vehicles, something that we think passengers like, certainly something we think drivers and operators and associations like. If you have CCTV, here's the standard it should meet. Second one, at the time it was called convictions, in part because Leeds had a convictions policy, now called suitability. We've had quite a lot of discussion about that over the last 2 or 3 meetings. So this is to take steps that an individual with convictions or allegations against them couldn't move from being licensed by one authority, then moving to another without being properly checked. So broadly, each authority would apply the same check, and particularly if it's a serious case, would apply the same period of time to refuse a license, to overcome well, you'll refuse my license for 8 years, maybe an authority will refuse my license for 2 years, I'm going to go get licensed there when the 2 years are up. That's the main thrust of the suitability policy, is that all of those 6 authorities that we're part of have adopted the same period of refusal for people for the very small number of people who've got that on their record. Thirdly, driver training, to develop common training policies and assessment methods and standards. the same pass or fail mark. We've agreed an 8-module driver training course. We haven't yet agreed driver refresher training that one of the 6 authorities does. That might be one of the areas that we discuss. If the training is very good, do we need refresher training? Could we do it another way? Enforcement capacity and practice to strengthen on-street enforcement. We know that every authority has got a sort of enforcement that's a complaints function, but actually what's happening in terms of identifying areas of risk. I've mentioned, for example, the school run, mentioned daytime. A lot of our enforcement focus on the nighttime economy. The enforcement officers that work in Leeds, it's primarily complaints during the day and casework, and at nighttime it's patrols, and probably over half of those patrols in Leeds city centre. So that might mean that we've got other areas of Leeds that we should be looking at. Fifth, information sharing, to improve information sharing about licence holders who are believed to pose a risk about passengers. That could include the example that I gave before around the driver who's suspended, failed an eye test. It's not a major issue there, but if someone's tempted to carry on working while they're not fit to work, it's something that we would want to know about if there was a concern there, and that's where you might have number plate recognition, or you might have put this vehicle on your radar, that sort of information. And then finally, vehicle conditions, to improve vehicle condition standards across the region so that a weak policy in one authority does not pose risks across the region. And that's the 6th area, and very clear later in the report, it's the area that we've made the least progress on. We've made much more progress on suitability, driver training, enforcement standards, information sharing. It's fair to say, I think, still somewhere apart in vehicle conditions. And in part, it's one of the hardest, I think it's probably one of the hardest areas to harmonise because of the effort it's going to take, or the pain it's going to take, or the discussion it's going to take to harmonise on a high, I would argue, on a higher vehicle standard in many authorities. Okay, so I'll pause there. I won't go into each of the 6 in detail, but I've provided it in the report. Just to pause it there and just see if there's any questions on those areas.
So just before going to that, I think one of the main purposes of this discussion is also not just to give a refresher, but to also help guide myself and Councillor Cooper in the conversations we'll be having with our regional colleagues. So as we go through this, be mindful that we'll be having those conversations, and obviously, so I'm very interested in finding out what the committee's thoughts are on some of these areas, whether they're still the right areas, whether they're not the right areas, whether there are other priorities. So at that point, I'll open up to any questions or comments at this stage for Andrew. Yep, Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for your report as well. I think everybody in the committee would welcome and appreciate your efforts to improve passenger safety. Obviously, that's paramount, and obviously working in a cross-authority way is really useful, and it's the way forward, and we all appreciate that. However, I do have some concern around the 6th point, which is the vehicle conditions element. We've all received reports, I'm sure you have yourself as well, about very high standards that Leeds in particular has. And you do actually recognise in your report under 3.22 that there is a perception that Leeds has particularly high standards. Now, we're getting reports of vehicles being turned away as inappropriate for chips, small chips, not being buffered before they go in for inspection, scratches on alloy wheels. Things that, to my mind, don't seem to have anything to do with passenger safety, and certainly wouldn't prevent me from going in a taxi if somebody had a scratch on their alloy wheel. Now, you mentioned as well in your report that we are losing drivers in Leeds. The reasons for that are multifaceted, I'm sure. But if there are particularly high standards, we're now moving. Obviously, the economy has changed since COVID. There are people are eating more takeaways, as we know. It's a similar profession, and easy for drivers to move from being a taxi driver into that industry with much less high standards, and easier access to that industry as well. In the respect of it's a cheaper investment to buy a car to be able to deliver takeaways than it is to be a taxi. Now, the impact that's having on our city, the reduced numbers. I mean, I work as a social worker, a frontline social worker, and I see firsthand that I can't get taxis for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. Now, you have acknowledged that as well. it's a difficult issue, but if you could address some of the concerns that we, over the reports that we've had, is now the right time to have such high standards on things like small scratches and scratches on alloy wheels, given the impact it's having on the industry and the wider impact on social services, our economy, our nighttime economy. It's all interlinked, isn't it?
Sorry, Andrew, just before you're coming, just to remind councillors, and I think this is a very important point, actually, public safety comes first, and there is a significant difference of public risk between someone doing a takeaway delivery and someone doing so. I appreciate the point, Councillor Gibson, but be very clear to the public watching as well. The council's first and only priority is public safety. So I appreciate the example you've given, but I do feel it's an unfair example. Andrew, if you want to come in, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor. I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of the discussion around vehicle conditions, Leeds City Council has got elements of its vehicle conditions policy that are not just about safety, it's also about appearance. I've never yet come across a vehicle that has only failed for one scratch or a scuffed alloy. We are reviewing the we've got a sort of 50-page checklist that shows every vehicle examiner how to inspect a vehicle in the same way. And I think there may well be borderline issues around things like curved alloys or scuffed alloys or minor dents, where we've got some advice that would say if the dent's smaller than a certain size, it's a minor dent, but it might depend on how it's been repaired. And that'd be very clear, that's about appearance, and probably that's about confidence and perception. So it's not just about safety. The areas that we were trying to harmonise in West Yorkshire were just around things like the ages of vehicles. So the majority of Leeds vehicles come off the fleet when they're 10, and it's just not the case in other authorities. And we've just seen Wakefield are consulting at the moment on their plans to inspect vehicles every 6 months. And that suggests to me that possibly they've got a high number of vehicles failing because they're allowing vehicles above a certain age to work. We don't necessarily have that number in Leeds. So I think particularly that it's absolutely part of that discussion. I think particularly in terms of the policy says the vehicle should be properly maintained. The policy says the vehicle should be maintained in line with the manufacturer's standard. That could mean that if you have a Toyota and you fit a Nissan hubcap and it says Nissan on it, that vehicle could be failed. I'd very much want the officer to say you need to get a new hubcap so that it matches with the three others. To do that, and I wouldn't necessarily see that as a fail. I would see that as what we would call an advisory to get that vehicle sorted out within so many days, and probably to be able to carry on working. What we're trying to do is to make sure that we're very, very clear about the standards at which we want people to work to. I'm sort of genuine. I've had many complaints and feedback probably over the past 12 months on people who said you failed my vehicle and it's failed for one scratch, and I've never yet found that scratch to be the only thing. I found some very serious other issues, and I would want to make sure that the licensing officers, the vehicle examiners, are not overstepping the mark in terms of failing every vehicle where they can. Their aim is to assess the vehicle and to be clear what's needed to bring that vehicle into compliance. And I think particularly I'd echo the chair's view, which is you might accept a food delivery from a vehicle with dents and concerns, but if passengers are regularly getting into vehicles that have got dents and body damage, the question might be, I wonder what else hasn't been maintained on the vehicles. That's possibly more to do with confidence rather than the mechanical safety of the vehicle. But our policy covers both, and I think it's as part there about our interpretation of that. It might be that we can explain that in that way. I think in terms of the risk of harm around that, and one of the things that we do in terms of on-street enforcement with neighbouring authorities is we aim to do one on-street joint operation with one of the neighbouring authorities every other month or something like that. And the enforcement operation we did in the summer in York, we found that a large majority of the vehicles in York failed the on-street inspection. So we think by having those tougher standards, actually those vehicles are much more likely to be fit for purpose when they're hailed or booked on street. So I'd probably just beware that what might be seen to be a tempting route to say they've got that policy in that other neighbouring authority. Why don't we move to that? but this is what I think we'll be having a lot of these discussions around harmonisation and particularly working with a trade that has, particularly people have lost months and months of earnings over the last 18 months. That doesn't mean the public should feel any less safe when they get in those vehicles. The question is, how do we achieve that, and how do we reach that point? I absolutely agree with you. Minor dents, minor scratches are not to do with safety until they're so long neglected that they do undermine the safety of the vehicle. But that's more to do with appearance and confidence. And those are spelt out in our policies, but that wouldn't necessarily be a large part of the what we've discussed previously. It would be basic issues like neighbouring authorities will allow a vehicle that had previously been written off. In Leeds, we wouldn't do, and so on. So that's a very brief update, but I absolutely hear what you're saying in terms of the feedback we're getting from people saying, I think your officers have been overzealous in failing a vehicle, and we are regularly reviewing that. Every single time there is a complaint about that, I will then review that with the manager, and we will talk to either the manager or the officer concerned to make sure that we don't have overzealous officers.
Okay, two issues. Thank you for that. First one is, what transparency is there with the reviews of the complaints you're having for officers failing for scratches and dints? That's the first question. Do we, as the committee, have access to review that? Is it just yourself? What does the industry? How are you working with the industry to communicate that actually it's more than just scratches and dints? And the second thing, look, let me be absolutely clear. Safety is paramount. It has to be paramount, and I'm proud that the city is leading the way in making sure that our passengers are the safest in the county. However, is it the time to, you've said it yourself, it's not just about safety. Part of this is about the conditions of the vehicles, the appearance of the vehicles, the aesthetics. Has that changed? Has your policies, has your standards for that changed since over the past couple of years? And if so, why now, when the industry is facing the toughest time? Why now, when adult social care is facing? Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off, Councillor Gibson. This is not relevant to the report that's in front of us, and I think you can send that as an email to Andrew. That's not relevant to the report that's in front of us. Councillor Martin.
Yes, thank you. And I do appreciate the complexity of this work that you've done, and appreciate all of the detail, but without a national framework that regulates taxis, I understand how difficult it is. But one of the questions that I've been asked is, how do you stop taxis coming from across the border that are less safe than our really high standard, which I appreciate you working for? So that's one question. And just also, when we're talking about passenger safety, taxis are a really important part of our transport network in Leeds, because of the inadequacy of the public transport system. When I moved here, it was, oh, it's fine, you can always get a taxi and they're quite cheap. It doesn't matter that the buses don't go where you need to. So in terms of passenger safety, taxis are really important for that, for getting to hospital, for getting in and out of town late at night. And so if we're looking at declining numbers of taxis in Leeds as a result of maybe requiring really costly changes to taxis and adaptations to taxis, how are we balancing that? How are we being sure? So first of all, how are we stopping less, like the Wolverhampton example, licensed taxis coming into Leeds? What happens when someone reports seeing a taxi from another area? And just how are we balancing this issue about the dropping numbers of taxis in Leeds, and what that has, the impact that has on public safety?
Thank you, Councillor. I mean, I think the first point, local authorities have got very limited powers. The powers our officers have would be to inspect vehicles on the street, and then to follow that up with checks then, maybe in some cases directly with the operator, but in some cases with the home licensing authority. You mentioned Wolverhampton. I know that Wolverhampton do send their own enforcement teams out and about across the UK to sort of live up to their responsibilities to check that they're enforcing. And I'd absolutely agree with you that the national framework just does not provide. I don't see why an enforcement officer who's employed in Leeds as past recruitment selection cannot take effective enforcement action against any taxi or private hire vehicle that we see in Leeds. We might end up having to do more information sharing protocols with more and more authorities rather than just give our officers the responsibilities so that you can have an enforcement anywhere. That's the position for blue badges anywhere. So you can have a blue badge from Cornwall. It appears in Leeds. Leeds can actually take enforcement action to check whether that that badge is being used properly. That's what we push for under the sort of the preamble to the statutory guidance. So the how do you stop the taxis is more to do with how do you inspect them on the street. We probably would check around 2,000 vehicles a year in our garage in terms of inspections, and we probably check the same number of vehicles on street every year. And we aim for between 10 and 20% of those on street inspections to be non-Leeds vehicles. So if an enforcement officer is working tonight and they approach a certain location and there's two private hire vehicles, one's from Leeds, one's not from Leeds, they will go to the non-Leeds one because they don't know when they're going to see that vehicle again. So I'm afraid that is boots on the ground. That is where actually the law gives local authorities very little powers. The law is different in London. So London, they are able to take some steps to prevent some element of cross-border working. So I'm sorry, it's hard work and probably hundreds and hundreds of vehicle checks every month, and then focused work then with those authorities to make sure then that those vehicles, those drivers, those operators, those bookings are properly made. Leeds doesn't have powers to refuse a vehicle or stop a vehicle at the border when it comes into Leeds, because although it meets the conditions of another authority, it wouldn't meet our conditions. We have no powers to do that. That vehicle is appropriately licensed by that licensing authority. Our work is in engaging and persuading the other authorities that where there is a concern about something, maybe they need to review their policies and procedures, and in some cases they actually need to check and see whether their approach is effective in making sure that the majority of vehicles, when they are inspected, and meet high standards, and the vast majority of drivers, when they're spoken to, have got a valid booking, I've got insurance, I've got all the appropriate information to hand. So I'm sorry, that's a really dry answer, Councillor. In terms of the second point on the public safety and even the design and type of vehicle, and I think particularly, I know now that Bradford are looking at the possibility of not having 100% of their Hackney carriage vehicles being wheelchair accessible. And that's because of the combination of COVID and also a clean air zone. It's actually very expensive to get a clean air zone compatible wheelchair accessible vehicle. They're incredibly expensive, about £65,000. Yeah. Really expensive compared to £25,000 for a Euro 6 version there. So absolutely, and I think particularly, there's not a week going by now that I'm not getting complaints from people living primarily in the suburbs, primarily outside the ring road, saying I can't get a wheelchair accessible vehicle. And I want to make sure that in our review we are paying attention to that. It's evident that we have the majority of wheelchair accessible vehicles in Leeds are Hackney carriages. Very, very, very few are private hire vehicles, and that feels something that we should be looking to amend. I think in terms of the specific points, it's sort of quite a narrow point. We're talking now to passenger transport about their contracts and their provision in terms of specific provision, and that might primarily be to do with education or to do with health and to do with social care. But I'm hoping that it will touch on other areas as well around the have we got the right size vehicles or the right types of vehicles in Leeds. We've actually allowed passenger transport to use rather slightly larger vehicles than would normally be seen as private hire vehicles in order to have that fleet composition. And we're absolutely having that discussion with passenger transport, maybe some other stakeholders there, but I'd be guided there by what the council's passenger transport service would be saying when we come to write our new contracts or we come to specify certain things. Can we put more in those contracts so that we're much clearer about what we expect?
Thank you for that, Andrew. And follow up.
Yes, thank you. It just, on the first point, it just feels so unfair, doesn't it? And so wrong that we have all of this conflict to deal with in Leeds because there's no national framework. So is there going to be, as part of this review, some robust representation to the relevant government department to get this this playing field level? It's pathetic, isn't it, that taxi drivers in York are getting licensed in Wolverhampton to get round. It's just madness, and the valuable officer time is being spent chasing people from across.
Sorry, I'm going to come in because that's more of a political question. The answer is yes. That's not really an officer question. That's a political question. And the answer is yes. I think just to restate, the Leeds position has always been we did not support deregulation. It's not, sorry, cross-border trading. It's not something we've been keen on because of these problems, but we are where we are and we have to work through it. And I know Councillor Cooper will make sure that Leeds' concerns are well heard at a national level, and obviously Councillor Cooper and myself will be working quite hard with our colleagues. But sorry to jump in there, Andrew, but that was more of a political question than an officer question. Any other questions or comments for Andrew? Councillor Illingworth.
Yes, Chair. I'd like to ask about the identification plates on private hire vehicles and licence cabs for that matter. It's always seemed to me that quite an important thing is that you should be able to recognise which taxis involve and identify it if something untoward takes place. And I find the badge is a bit small. A large part of it is taken up with the logo for the company, and only a relatively small area at one end is actually got the vital details which taxi is which. And it just struck me that there might be an opportunity when you're doing the realignment to standardise on a more visible plate that you could easily read from a distance. And I'd like your comments on that.
Absolutely no politics involved in this question, Chair. I'd absolutely agree with you. I think particularly what we have in Leeds is we have a provision for the stickers or the identification on the vehicle that almost every single angle to look at the vehicle, you can identify that it's either a taxi or a private hire. You can identify who the operator is if it's a private hire. You can identify the authority that it's licensed in. That's on the door as well as on the rear of the vehicle. And in Leeds as well, we've got provision for windscreen and rear windscreen stickers at the top. And that's not in place in other authorities. And I think particularly having spent a large chunk of half term driving through West Yorkshire to Sheffield and then through West Yorkshire to Manchester from Leeds to see the difference there. There is a regional sort of minimum standards approach in Greater Manchester that I think we're quite interested in, and that's one of the areas that they've struck upon. I think particularly there, it would feel like quite low-hanging fruit compared to other things around vehicle conditions to say, look, even if we don't agree on vehicle conditions, can we at least agree the same framework for making it easy to know, is it your vehicle? Who is the operator? You've made the booking with the operator. You've not made the booking with the driver if it's a private hire, and particularly there, which authorities or what the vehicle number is. So we also have provision for the vehicle number inside the vehicle. So if there's a complaint, someone can say I was in vehicle 55 or whatever. I haven't got vehicle 55 on my mind about anything. So particularly, so they would be so if we can't agree on absolutely every aspect of vehicle, we can say we've got the same approach to livery, to stickers, the same approach to legibility. I would say we've got a very, very small percentage of complaints to Leeds City Council about taxi and private hire, where people say I couldn't get the name, or I couldn't get the number, or I've only got part of the, and that in parts because we've got livery on every angle, and we can normally find a way. It would probably be fewer than 5% of cases where we say we tried to chase it down, but it's a white Skoda Octavia, no other information. We're not going to be able to get that vehicle. I think the figures are higher in other authorities because they don't have livery on every angle, that mean that they've got higher percentage of complaints that they can't investigate, because there aren't enough markers on the outsides of those vehicles. I'm not sure what we're doing about the size of the stickers, although we do get regular correspondence about that. So I'll look at that and I'll see if the size is comparable with other authorities.
Any other questions, comments, because I'm quite keen to get into a bit where we talk about potentially what the potential future priorities should be to help inform myself and Councillor Cooper. So any other questions or comments on so far on this point before we go on to a more general conversation around that direction? Yep.
Thanks, Chair. One thing that concerns me, a comment that Andrew made, and stop me if you won't allow it, and it's not totally relevant, but you were saying that the number of licensees in Leeds were down. They could have gone to other parts of the industry, as it were, you know, like delivery drivers. The question I'd like to ask, if it's possible, is that drop in figure the same over West Yorkshire, or is it worse in Leeds? Because if it is worse in Leeds, it could lead back to the harmonisation issue and the fact that we're a higher standards authority, and we could be losing out with that. And that might be something we need to play into to try and get a grip on, so that we don't lose all of our drivers. So is it they're going because of our standards, or is it another reason that there isn't the work? And if we're losing it to other authorities and other authorities don't raise their standards, we could end up with our drivers not having our drivers here and having them all coming in. And, you know, I think I'm making sense there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, really pertinent, Councillor. I think in terms of the figures that I checked, probably the end of September, in terms of 700 vehicles fewer, 300 drivers fewer. In addition, we've got another 600 plus drivers who are telling us at the moment they're not working. So that's a significant reduction. It's more than 10% of the vehicle fleet, and it's certainly more than 10% of the driver fleet, more like 15% of the driver availability. And again, the feedback from the trade reps has been they don't think some of these drivers are coming back. That's not quite the same as saying those drivers are not coming back to Leeds, but they're going to move somewhere else, because to some degree the work we've done on driver training and suitability has meant that it's probably harder and more time consuming to start again in another authority than it would be to renew in Leeds. So I genuinely don't think that's the case. I think the position possibly across West Yorkshire is that everybody's lost some capacity, but we're meeting at the end of next week, so we'll find out, and I specifically put that item on the agenda. I do think that in some authorities, smaller number, 700 vehicles it would be an enormous number to other licensing authorities. So again, I think we would be hearing about that, and I haven't heard. The majority of our neighbouring authorities have got a sort of similar sort of driver profile as we do in Leeds. I'm not sure about York in terms of that. York is an odd one. We've got people who are licensed to work as private hire drivers in Leeds who live in Scarborough, who live on the other side of York, and I suspect possibly they might work in York more often than they work in Leeds. So I don't know, but I think those numbers will be more around the margins, Councillor. I do think that we are looking, it's almost the equivalent of, and in terms of entertainment licensing, of having empty buildings. We're going to have vehicles that are arguably either licensed and they're going to be allowed to expire, and they'll just sit on drives and then they'll have their stickers taken off. And what we want to find out from the trade is whether those people are prepared to come back. They're planning to come back for the sort of winter rush, the winter shopping, Christmas, so I think we're quite pessimistic. I don't think all of those drivers and vehicles are coming back. We've got a backlog of about 100 new people who want to train to drive, and we'll get those drivers or applicants will have certainly started their training this month. In terms of that, that's a good sign that there's arguably 100 or so who would want to do that. We would normally train about 50 people a month, so that's a positive sign. It would be concerning if there were no people wanting to apply, and I know certainly the Hackney associations and the private hire operators, I could see vehicles with drivers wanted being driven around in Leeds, so I know that they're looking to recruit as well. But in some cases, I think it may be more the within trade changes. People are moving to some of the operators that are providing a financial bounty, like the delivery companies, to say we'll compete with delivery companies and we'll give you a bounty if you come and work for us.
Thanks. Through you, Chair, is it possible to ask for a report to a future meeting about the taxi driver numbers that we have within Leeds, the ones that we're losing, and seeing if we can identify where we're losing and what percentage of taxis in Leeds are being driven by Leeds license holders as opposed to those from outside the district. Some sort of report around that so we can see a movement of travel to see whether we are losing drivers in Leeds or whether the trade as a whole is losing, and percentage wise we're in line, or are we suffering? And
yeah, I think that's a reasonable question. Where we work into our work program, because obviously I appreciate we've got a lot of work coming up, but we'll sit down and we'll have a chat about how we can get that together in a way that's reasonable to officer time, bearing in mind we are going to be having a very busy work schedule in terms of the conversation we're having trade, but it's a reasonable request. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions or comments before? Because the recommendation on this is rather, as I say, rather slim. It just to note the report. But as I said, I am keen to hear from members of the committee. Are the 6 areas that we had, were they right? Should we have different areas? What are people's thoughts? Because as I said, Councillor Cooper will be having conversations with her counterparts. I'll be having conversations with my counterparts. Andrew will be having conversations with his counterparts. So to have a flavour from the elected members of the city as to where they feel prioritizations. Some of them dead horses that we're just flogging. We should give. I'm interested in finding out people's opinions, so I'll open up to the floor on that point for people to pass comment on those views. It's a council meeting, so we will be having plenty of meetings at the end of this month and going forward. So I need to give it to elected members because that's the job they're here for today.
Mr. Chair, I agree with you, but until you guys decide to listen to the trade and to sort your issues out, we will never get anywhere. We can have 20 meetings in this hall, and the things that have come across from some of your councillors are really brilliant and they're talking sense. But we, the trade, are suffering, and my drivers, I cannot get drivers for my hackney carriages. The people are leaving and they're going to Bradford to get a car licensed there with tinted windows and working in Leeds, and we are just going on the circle and not doing anything like that. And the solution is, let's have a working group from this table here, sit down with the trade and say, these are your solutions.
So, right, with complete respect, I completely agree. We need to work through these. You've already had commitments from myself and Councillor Cooper that we will sit down with the trade as often as you like to go through these things. What I have said to all the representatives of those meetings is what I do not want to have is in these meetings is a free-for-all anymore. Things must be done logically and sensibly, because otherwise we're going to try and eat an elephant in this room every single time. So I completely agree. The trade meetings are being booked in for the end of this month. I will be now chairing those trade meetings rather than an officer to make sure there's proper oversight and strategic look. We will be having those meetings. Councillor Cooper will be having meetings with her counterparts. I will be having meetings with my counterpart, and I will meet with the trade every week if it likes, because in the end, I do want a sensible working relationship. There have been issues that have gone on for far too long. And in this committee, sometimes we've tried to resolve absolutely every single thing at every single meeting. And you're right, it hasn't worked. There is a new chair. There is a new executive member. We've been really open and frank about how we want to approach things, and that's how we will approach those. But I am mindful that this is a council meeting in public, not a public meeting, and you will have as many opportunities as you want with me to raise every single issue, and we will work through them. Sometimes you will be happy, sometimes you won't, and sometimes we will compromise. But that has been mine and Councillor Cooper's honest, straightforward position since we've been coming to the post that we're in, that we will be open, upfront, honest, and have those difficult conversations, but in a sensible, strategic, prioritized way. So I applaud you for defending your drivers. That's what you're there for, completely. We have a role here as councillors as well, and we need to go through that process. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but I need to open up to council because I want to hear what the elected members who represent the people of the city want those conversations to be had, that me and Councillor Cooper will be having with our counterparts. So can I open up to any members on the committee who wish to comment on anything, on what they think the priorities should be going forward? Yeah, Councillor Gibson.
Thank you, Chair. And if it's not suitable for licensing, obviously tell me. I'm new to licensing. So, but is there scope to look at the sort of holistic impact of these policies? Obviously, you heard me talk about adult social care, but our economy, everything, because it does impact. Obviously, taxis do impact on all facets of, well, most facets of life in the city. Thank you. I don't know if it is a life. It's
This bit's open to for what? Because obviously it's going to inform conversations we're going to potentially have. So there's probably no right or wrong answer at this particular point. Any other comments? I think you wanted to say something earlier, Councillor Flynn, or you wanted to come in now? Yeah, by all means, yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it's a wee bit long, so please bear with me. I think we all appreciate the regulatory difficulties that private hire licensing and cross-bordering have caused the VLE. With absolutely no doubts about that. And of course, there's very little we can do about it. But I just wanted to endorse what Paul, Lisa and James have actually said and perhaps go a bit further. I don't think anybody here, anybody in the trade has got any issues at all with the principle of harmonisation. It's all about the safety of passengers, and that's what the whole business is all about. But I do have issues about the timing and about the practicalities. The main issues right from the start, irrespective of the 6 items that we've that have been discussed for the last 4 years or so, have always been around driver and vehicle conditions. And we're now moving towards vehicle conditions, and you can see from the paper how many difficulties they're going to be, quite apart from the correspondence that we've all had during the last sort of week or so. I think the indication this week that Kirklees are taking or having some kind of consultation about their policies. I've no idea what that means, but does that actually gel with the harmonisation principles we've got? Sorry, it's a rhetorical question, Paul. The trade, I think, as we've all said, had been very hard hit by COVID, probably as bad as any other part of the economy in Leeds, because when anything is hit in Leeds, taxi trade is probably going to be hit the hardest. There's been some agreement on harmonisation, but in my view, not in the very key areas that affect the trade. When we eventually agree, if we ever do agree on harmonisation or whatever, we've got 10 enforcement officers in Leeds to enforce the city for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's 3 officers per 8 hours. And that's assuming they go out on 3 shifts, which I know they actually don't. So whatever is decided in the long term, we don't have the enforcement officers to enforce the issues anyway. We've all heard about further Uber encroachment within the last week or 10 days, where they appear to be inviting their drivers, no matter where they live, to give a preference on where they want to work. And given the fact that they all seem to end up in Leeds, the question's already answered itself. That, to me, does not actually gel with the agreement that Uber have made with us about West Yorkshire drivers and all of the rest of it. They're pushing the envelope as hard as they possibly can in exactly the same way as they've done in other areas of the country. It's not fair to our drivers. I mentioned Uber, but I'm sure other app companies are doing exactly the same kind of thing. There's certainly a need to go back to the national group, if it is still in existence, to talk about cross-bordering and the pretty much imposition of app taxis and private hire. So my suggestion is this: given all the problems that the trade is facing at the moment, we've mentioned the 10% reduction or even more in the numbers. Rick has discussed how we can actually discover whether or not this is just Leeds or affects all West Yorkshire, although I suspect you won't be able to do that because we don't know about the rest of West Yorkshire. My suggestion, and given the agonising we've had over the convictions policy for the last 18 months, which I think highlighted the problems we had with consultation from day one, despite the efforts of 1 or 2 of us to pause that and to give it some consideration, it took the introduction of a new chairman of this particular group and a new lead officer, a new lead member rather, to actually go back to the drawing board on it, which we're now doing within the process of consultation on all the rest of it. But I strongly suspect that you're not going to have any form of agreement on the convictions policy to reduce it from what it is currently to what we have suggested it might be of 9 points and the 7 and all the rest of it. So my proposal, and I'm not asking this to be voted on today or whatever, and I did try to discuss this with Debbie this morning, but unfortunately she's off this particular week, so there is no party political emphasis on this at all. I've discussed it informally with Linda this morning on the way in, because she asked me a couple of questions about one or two of the items on the agenda. I haven't discussed it with my colleagues. But why don't we pause the discussions with the trade until the trade has recovered regarding harmonisation? Paul's already outlined what he and what Debbie Cooper are actually going to be doing with the other West Yorkshire authorities. And it does seem to me we're going back to the drawing board, which is what we maybe should have done 4 years ago. And no matter what, and I, a lot of respect for you, Andrew, but I will disagree with you profoundly on whether we've made much progress on the harmonisation issues, given that it's always going to be driver and vehicle conditions that will cause the problems here. So my suggestion, and this is only a suggestion, is that basically let's pause this until we have a proper discussion with the trade and talk it through thoroughly and get some form of agreement. Thanks, Paul.
Any other question? Yep, Councillor Martin.
Just leading on from what Councillor Flynn's just raised about Uber and the impact that Uber has, unfair competition that Uber has on taxi drivers across the country and in different countries. And I've mentioned to Andrew when I was first elected about looking into establishing a taxi driver co-op or supporting. I know it wouldn't be us to do it, would be, but could we investigate this? Because I know that other cities have started to do that. I know that Cardiff has one and Preston are having one. And the advantage of that is that the taxi drivers could have an app similar to Uber, and it would, but unlike Uber, that cooperative would be run in the interests of taxi drivers in Leeds, and it would meet a lot of the objectives that Andrew mentioned for passengers in terms of being able to engage local taxi drivers, as well as the impact on the economy of being able to contract with the Leeds taxi driver co-op, whether it was adult social care, children's schools, etc. So the benefit to the local economy would be good. The benefit to taxi drivers of running that company for themselves, for their own profit. Could we expand to looking across across West with partners across West Yorkshire?
I think that one is definitely in the political realm. So that'll be for one and me and Councillor Cooper to maybe discuss slightly off outside of the meeting, because that's getting involved in the market directly rather than just being a regulator. But I take the point as a member of the co-op party as well, and I like co-ops in general. Andrew, can you do one second? Can you mind coming back to on the consultation bit about what we're doing with the current consultation? Because obviously, Councillor Flynn raised about the consultation. I just want to make sure members are aware actually where we are with the consultation. It's slightly off-piste, but I think it's a pertinent point after what Councillor Flynn has said.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. In terms of the consultation on the suitability that we discussed possibly 3 meetings ago now, suitability minor points, the consultation ends on Monday, the 15th of November, so a week on Monday. We'll then have a period of analysis to see. I know we've got we've got more than 2,000 completed questionnaires, which is really good. We've got a number of incomplete questionnaires, and people have needed a little bit of guidance online to go back and finish off the survey. We've also got quite a lot of comments on social media that maybe aren't quite the same, or representation aren't quite the same as completed surveys, and we'll have to work out how to take that into account. So that week beginning the 15th, I think there'll be quite a lot of meetings between us and the communications team or the consultation and feedback team and legal, just to work out exactly how we can review what we've got back. If you remember, we asked a very specific question, which is, following the working group, following the other work, we're considering doing this. Do you agree? And if no, tell us why not. So it's very, very clear. The previous consultation on suitability, I think, had more than 30 questions, and I think we've got learned a very clear lesson to have shorter consultation questions. Interestingly, it was 30 questions that were the same across all 6 authorities, so it was something where we'd at least harmonised on that. So the consultation will probably have the findings mid-late November. I think we're timetabled to discuss it, John, in January. at licensing committee, and then subsequently at executive board following the discussion here in terms of what we've got. And again, the papers for licensing committee, we would also then have the face-to-face trade meetings up and running as well. If we're aiming for one every 3 months, we would be having, I think we're looking at the 1st and 2nd of December, so maybe first and 2nd of March in terms of other meetings, regular discussion. And I would have thought that the trade meetings would focus very much on current issues, and I think then other issues that are sort of longer term, either good ideas or need evaluation. Councillor Downs, one of the suggestions that you asked for, I'm sure is on open data somewhere in terms of our month-by-month figures. I guarantee it won't be for every authority in West Yorkshire, but I can probably lay my hands on some of that information very quickly. In terms of the timing, then it will come back. It will probably go. We'll probably have a chairs brief early January on the consultation on suitability.
Thank you for that, Andrew. So, I mean, so far from the conversation we've got basically to go back and review what harmonisation looks like, which is pretty much what myself and Councillor Cooper were intending to do with our colleagues. I've got out of that also looking, basically vehicle standards being the big sticking point in terms, and I just want to gauge from members, because it's not being clear, are members saying they feel that that's an impossible task? Are they saying it's something that we should have an extra push on? Because we've mentioned it, but I've not actually got a really clear kind of, yay, try and have another go at it, or no, focus on something else. So I'd be interested to get a flavour of what members are actually thinking on that one, because that is the big contentious one, and I'm sure it will form quite a large part of the conversations myself and Councillor Cooper will be having with our counterparts. So are we saying give it one more heat, see if we can get it over the line, or are we saying we need to focus elsewhere and maybe let our officers start concentrating on our own vehicle standards separately as a local authority? Any opinions? Oh, I see a lot of people thinking. Yeah, Andrew.
I'm quite happy to share this after the meeting. I mentioned Greater Manchester's recent consultation. That's 11 authorities, and they've got 4 themes. Their themes are drivers, vehicles, operators, and licensing authorities, and that's things like service standard turnaround time. So each one has got probably 3 or 4 bullet points underneath that would fit that. They're still not trying to cover everything. I'd absolutely agree with Councillor Flynn that one of the areas that we think is missing on the West Yorkshire work is the operator conditions, particularly cross-border, but particularly the lever we need to ensure that cross-border doesn't mean risks being imported into Leeds is the operator conditions there. I think particularly in terms of the Greater Manchester, interesting they've got a balance between those 4 areas, and it probably indicates a degree of engagement and consultation with the trade as well, to say, why does it take 9 months to get licensed in this authority and 3 months to get licensed in this authority? So that's not license shopping to evade regulation. That's to do with maybe the capacity or the IT or the customer service function of each of the authorities. So just to have that discussion, just maybe, Chair, if you want to check back with members and say, as part of the discussion, what other city regions are doing, it feels like a more balanced approach. I mean, I think probably our approach based on 2016, it was very strongly skewed towards the drivers. It's if you're talking about risks to vulnerable people, the number one risk would be arguably from a driver who's not fit and proper, for whom they've chosen taxi or private hire driving as a means of gaining access to vulnerable people. Number 2 would be drivers who turn a blind eye to something inappropriate going on between 2 passengers. Number 3 might be unroadworthy vehicles. In terms of those areas of risk, even though the numbers are very, very small, I think in terms of that. So quite interested in having that discussion about, as ever, to do with the funding for regional development. The Northwest seems to get more funding and more attention. We invited the central government body to come and look at Leeds, and they didn't do. And then in their final report, they put a whole map in of Greater Manchester, talking about what Greater Manchester is doing. So particularly there, I think we can have a discussion of ideas, and it might be worthwhile us looking at other areas. But I think particularly in terms of if we are concerned and interested in cross-border, one of the areas we might want to talk about is what's the lever we would like on operators, but also what's the lever that we would like neighbouring authorities to do, bearing in mind it's about their vehicles driving in Leeds. I
think a helpful intervention, and I think Prouds in Leeds. I don't think any of us like being outdone by Manchester. So yes, I think that would be probably something that would be helpful to use if members would find it helpful to use, because I think it does give a flavour of what other parts of the country are doing. Bearing in mind also the Department of Transport are slowly looking at trying to cover the gaps of, I think it's around over 30 other policy areas over the next couple of coming years, or something roughly like that. So there's a lot going on, and some of it will become from on high and some of it will be very much in our control. But the flavour I'm getting is very much actually what myself and Councillor Cooper are intending to do anyway, which is to go away and speak to the other authorities, find out where we are, find out where they are, and actually look at what actually the priorities are going forward. And it may be a more balanced approach like Manchester. It may be that actually they have particular emphasis that they want to look at, and there's a bit of authority to authority negotiations to where those focuses are. But I think, and again, just to give reassurance to the trade, look, we generally do understand there are issues and there is a backlog of concerns that we need to work through. It's about how we get to there in a sensible place. Again, without trying to eat that elephant all at once, to use that expression, because it hasn't really got us anywhere. And we've got some things done, but there's a lot more to talk about. So I'm getting that mine and Councillor Cooper's direction of travel, which is to have those conversations, is what the committee is comfortable with, unless someone says otherwise. And that will, by the sounds of it, go away and inform a slightly more. Oh, yeah, Councillor.
Yeah, I'm just going to broadly agree, actually, Chair, because it just seems to me that taking Councillor Flynn's suggestion of a pause, in a way, by the time these consultations have taken place and further discussions and so on, it's going to be 2, 3, 4 months down the line, by which time society will have normalised even more. So things will be much more back to normal by then.
Any other Councillor, oh, you're fighting over each other. Which one got there first?
You've already had your pitch. Yeah, I mean, it is just to absolutely reiterate, if the consultation is at the stage where there will be meaningful, information coming in that direction, plus we then have the work which you will do with your counterparts elsewhere, plus information from Manchester, it seems to me that we're almost working to something which is more, certainly not just regionally based, but more nationally based. In other words, the areas that will impact on our city and on the trade within our city. And therefore, one would hope that you will be getting a better overall approach to it, something which is more pragmatic, which reflects the needs and the safety aspects of it, but on the other hand, is working in a more pragmatic way towards a solution.
Councillor Flynn.
Thanks, Paul. A quick one. I know that we've got issues about the issuing, well, we have to issue private hire licenses. We've got no alternative other than to issue them. Are we restricted in the same way with operators, or can we pick and choose which operators we have in Leeds?
The law is the same. We should only refuse a license if we're not satisfied that someone is fit and proper. So that would be the individual who's the operator. We can, of course, place conditions if there's something that we have a concern about, or to use the same analogy, not satisfied about. And that was very much, if you remember, when we talked about having a review of operator conditions, cross-border use of smartphone apps, use of these taxi kiosks that don't have a full booking, but they're used by private hire operators. So there absolutely is remit for us to have additional conditions on some operators. But no, the only reason we would refuse someone an operator is that we're not satisfied they're fit and proper.
Do we have any further comments or questions before I ask us to note the report formally? No? Are we okay to note the report for this item? If you can show your hands. Thank you very much. And that, again, thank you, because it's going to inform very useful conversations for myself and Councillor Cooper, so I appreciate that very much. Just quickly going on to the rest of the agenda. There is one bit missing, which is the forward works programme on my little script. So if people want to note the forward work programme at the back of your packs, again, if there are any other suggestions, bearing in mind there's probably going to be quite a lot of work going on the taxi and private hire section after the consultation, please do feed those in. Item agenda number 10, date and time of the next meeting. To note that the next meeting will take place on Tuesday, the 14th of December 2021 at 10 a.m. in Leeds Civic Hall. That concludes the business for today's meeting. Thank you for your attendance and contribution.